Every winter, colonies die surrounded by honey, not because the beekeeper failed to feed them, not because the stores ran out, but because the cluster could not move 3 inches to the left. That single biological constraint, the inability of a winter cluster to relocate laterally across comb in sustained cold, has killed more colonies than most beekeepers realize. And the frustrating part is that the honey was right there, on the next frame, untouched. Have you experienced this in your own hives? If you've ever opened a dead-out in February and found frames still heavy with capped honey beside a starved-out cluster, you already know how disorienting that moment feels. If this kind of biology-first breakdown is what you look for in beekeeping content, like goes a long way in helping others find it. This is not a feeding problem. It is a physics problem, and it has been misunderstood for well over a century. To make sense of what actually happens inside a winter hive, it helps to step back to the late 1800s and early 1900s, when beekeepers in Northern Europe and the American Midwest were first documenting consistent patterns of winter loss that did not match starvation in the traditional sense. These were not colonies that had been left without provisions. They were colonies that had been provisioned carefully, sometimes generously, and still died clustered tightly on empty comb with full frames just a short distance away. Early observers noted the pattern but lacked the thermoregulatory framework to explain it. They often blamed the bees themselves: weak genetics, poor queens, insufficient population. What most beekeepers misunderstand is this: the problem is not the colony's strength, it is the architecture of heat retention and the biological limits of individual bee mobility at low temperatures. The winter cluster is not a static ball of bees waiting for spring. It is a thermoregulatory structure, a living insulation system that contracts and expands based on ambient temperature. When outside temperatures drop, the cluster tightens. Bees on the outer shell pack closer together, reducing surface area, slowing heat loss. Bees in the interior generate metabolic heat by vibrating flight muscles. The core temperature of a healthy winter cluster typically remains between 20 and 35 degrees Celsius, even when ambient hive temperature drops well below freezing. This is the mechanism that keeps the colony alive, but it is also the mechanism that can trap it. Here is the critical detail. As the cluster consumes the honey stores immediately surrounding it, it must expand or shift to access adjacent stores. In moderate cold, this works. The cluster loosens slightly on warmer days or during brief temperature rises, edges outward, contacts new comb, and the bees on the periphery begin consuming the next available honey. But during sustained cold snaps, prolonged periods where ambient temperature inside the hive cavity remains well below freezing, the cluster cannot loosen. It locks in place. The outer shell of bees becomes functionally immobile, strong colony, empty frames. Individual honeybees enter a state approaching chill coma when their body temperature drops to roughly 5.5 degrees Celsius. At that threshold, muscular coordination fails. The bee cannot move. Now consider the bees on the outer edge of the cluster. Their body temperature hovers only slightly above that threshold. They are the insulation layer, absorbing cold so the interior bees can stay warm. They are doing their job. But the cost of doing that job is near total immobility. They cannot break away from the cluster shell, cross even a small gap of cold air, and reattach to the next frame of honey. The energy expenditure of that crossing, even a distance of an inch or two, would drop their body temperature below the functional threshold. They would fall. They would die. So they stay. This means the cluster does not starve because there is no food. It starves because it cannot reach the food. The honey on the next frame might as well be a mile away. And this is where the visual contradiction becomes stark. Open the hive after a winter loss of this kind, and the scene looks paradoxical. a tight ball of dead bees on the center frames, heads thrust into empty cells in the classic starvation posture, and full capped honey frames on either side, sometimes just one frame away. To anyone unfamiliar with cluster thermoregulation, it looks impossible. It looks like neglect, but it is neither. It is physics. Honey inches away, colony frozen in place. The risk of this failure mode increases dramatically under specific conditions that every beekeeper managing colonies through winter should understand. The first condition is hive geometry. In a standard Langstroth hive, frames hang vertically in parallel. The cluster typically forms in the center of the box and consumes honey by moving upward through the frames over the course of winter. Upward movement is easier for the cluster because warm air rises, and the bees at the top of the cluster are already closer to the warmest zone. Lateral movement, however, shifting from one frame to the next sideways, requires the cluster to bridge a gap of cold air between combs. In a standard Langstroth, with bee space of roughly 3/8 of an inch, that gap is small but thermally significant when ambient temperature is very low. The bees on the edge of the cluster face a wall of cold air between their current position and the next frame. That is enough to stall lateral movement entirely during a deep cold snap. The second condition is food placement. If the beekeeper has arranged stores so that the heaviest honey frames are on the outer edges of the box, with lighter or partially consumed frames in the center, the cluster will burn through its central stores first and then face the lateral movement problem at exactly the worst time, deep winter, when temperatures are lowest and the cluster is least able to expand. This is a common configuration because during fall, the bees often backfill the brood nest center with late-season honey, leaving peripheral frames fully capped. The result is a food distribution pattern that works against the cluster's natural movement tendency. If you value biology-based beekeeping, consider subscribing. The third condition is colony size. A smaller cluster has a higher surface area to volume ratio, which means it loses heat faster and must contract more tightly to compensate. A tightly contracted cluster has even less capacity for lateral movement. It is locked into a smaller footprint on fewer frames, consuming those frames faster and reaching the critical point. Central stores exhausted, peripheral stores unreachable, sooner. This is one reason why colonies that seem adequately provisioned in autumn can still fail in winter. The math of heat loss and food access works differently for a cluster covering 4 frames than for one covering 8. The fourth condition is ventilation and moisture. Excessive moisture inside the hive can condense on cold comb surfaces, chilling the bees on the cluster's outer edge even further and accelerating heat loss. A damp hive interior narrows the thermal margin that the cluster needs to maintain peripheral bee mobility. Some historical beekeeping texts from the upper Midwest in the early 20th century specifically noted that colonies in poorly ventilated hives were more likely to exhibit this starvation pattern, even with equivalent stores, compared to colonies in hives with better airflow. The moisture connection is indirect but measurable. Damp air conducts heat away from the cluster faster than dry air, and condensation dripping onto the cluster edge can be lethal to bees already operating near their thermal minimum. So, what can be done? The practical interventions fall into 3 categories: pre-winter preparation, midwinter management, and emergency response. None of them are dramatic. None of them guarantee survival. But each one reduces the probability of this specific failure mode. Pre-winter preparation is the most effective intervention point. The goal is to ensure that food stores are distributed in a pattern that supports the cluster's natural movement, primarily upward, with adequate stores directly above and immediately adjacent to the cluster's likely winter position. In a 2-deep Langstroth configuration, this means confirming that the upper box is heavy with capped honey, ideally 60 to 70 pounds total across both boxes in northern climates. But weight alone is not enough. Distribution matters. The beekeeper should verify that the frames immediately flanking the cluster's center position are well provisioned, not just the outermost frames. If the heaviest frames are on the edges and the center frames are light, consider rearranging. Some experienced beekeepers move the fullest frames inward by 1 or 2 positions in early autumn before the cluster forms, to ensure the bees have contiguous food access through the center of the box. This is not a universal recommendation. Moving frames can disrupt late-season brood rearing if done too late. But when timed before the cluster sets in mid to late October in temperate northern climates, it can materially reduce the lateral access problem. The second preparation step involves managing hive ventilation. An upper entrance or a slightly propped inner cover can allow moisture to escape without creating a direct draft across the cluster. And the goal is not airflow through the cluster, but moisture removal above it. Some beekeepers use moisture quilts, shallow boxes filled with wood shavings or burlap placed above the inner cover to absorb condensation. This practice has strong historical roots in northern European beekeeping and was adapted by American beekeepers in the upper Midwest by the early 20th century. The principle is straightforward: reduce moisture, preserve the thermal margin, maintain peripheral bee mobility for as long as possible. Midwinter management is more limited because opening the hive in cold weather accelerates exactly the heat loss that causes the problem. However, there is one intervention with historical support: the brief midwinter heft check. By lifting one side of the hive gently, the beekeeper can estimate remaining stores by weight without breaking the seal. A hive that feels light in January, or in a region where cold weather will persist through March, is a candidate for emergency feeding. The heft check does not solve the lateral access problem directly, but it identifies colonies that have consumed stores faster than expected and may be approaching the critical point. Emergency feeding during winter is a subject of ongoing debate, but the most commonly recommended method for addressing this specific starvation risk is the application of solid sugar, either fondant, sugar bricks, or dry granulated sugar on a paper placed directly on top of the frames above the cluster. The key word is directly. The sugar must be in contact with or immediately above the cluster so the bees can reach it without breaking cluster integrity. A sugar brick placed on the far side of the inner cover, separated from the cluster by even a few inches of cold air, may be useless. The emergency feed acts as a bridge, not a replacement for proper provisioning, but a temporary food source that keeps the cluster alive long enough for a warming period to arrive, during which the bees can shift onto adjacent honey frames. Temperature ranges for this intervention matter. If daytime highs are not expected to reach above roughly 4 to 7 degrees Celsius within the next 2 to 3 weeks, the sugar bridge is buying time but may not be sufficient on its own. There is a common mistake worth noting here. Some beekeepers, upon discovering a light hive in midwinter, attempt to feed liquid syrup. In cold weather, liquid syrup is counterproductive. The bees cannot evaporate the moisture from it efficiently at low temperatures, which increases hive humidity, accelerates heat loss, and worsens the exact thermal conditions that cause the problem. Solid feed only. No liquid. Not until sustained daytime temperatures are regularly above 10 degrees Celsius and the bees are flying. Another timing risk emerges in late winter, during the period from late January through February in many northern climates, when the queen begins laying again. The resumption of brood rearing increases the cluster's metabolic demand significantly. The bees must now maintain brood nest temperature around 34 to 35 degrees Celsius in the core, which requires more fuel. This is often the period of highest starvation risk, not deep December. The colony may have had adequate stores through the coldest period but runs critically short during the late winter brood rearing acceleration. Beekeepers who check stores only in November and assume the colony is set until spring often miss this late winter drawdown. The historical record supports the biological picture. Langstroth himself, writing in the mid-19th century, noted that colonies could die with honey in the hive and attributed it to the bees' inability to move in extreme cold. By the early 20th century, beekeepers in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Ontario were developing wintering practices specifically aimed at maintaining cluster mobility, including the use of insulated outer covers, reduced entrances, and careful store placement. These were not innovations born from theory. They were responses to observed losses. Beekeepers opened dead colonies. I saw the honey, saw the starved cluster, and worked backward to understand what had gone wrong. The core lesson has not changed in over 100 years. The winter cluster is a survival structure, but it is also a constraint. Its thermoregulatory function, the thing that keeps the colony alive, is the same thing that limits its movement. Every degree of cold tightens the cluster. Every degree of tightening reduces the colony's ability to access stores that are not in direct contact with the cluster mass. The margin between survival and starvation in a cold winter is not primarily a question of how much honey is in the hive. It is a question of where that honey is relative to the cluster and whether the cluster can reach it when it needs to. More bees do not solve this problem. Better food placement does. The bees have not changed. They still thermoregulate the same way they did 1,000 years ago. The cluster still contracts in cold and expands in warmth. Individual workers still lose motor function near 5.5 degrees Celsius body temperature. What has changed is our understanding of why colonies fail and the practical steps available to reduce avoidable losses. None of these steps are complicated. Check store weight. Verify food distribution around the cluster. Manage moisture. Provide emergency solid feed directly above the cluster when needed. Respect the biology. Respect the timing. If this breakdown was useful, leave a comment with your experience. Subscribe for more historically grounded beekeeping insights.